Today we are talking to Ed Caesar, the author of 2 Hours, The Quest to Run the Impossible Marathon. Welcome to Redera.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You're welcome. You have written a very fascinating book on a very interesting topic to many of our listeners. What is the book all about, and what is the central theme or the message of the book?
The book is about the quest to break 2 hours for the marathon, which many people believe to be impossible. So the 2 hour marathon is like the Everest of distance running. It's this point somewhere off in the future where people think maybe beyond the physiological capabilities of the world's greatest runners, and many others think will be broken in the next 10 or 15 years. But it's somewhat like the 4 minute mile in terms of its, iconic status within the sport. And using that as my narrative thread, I then talk about the lives of the greatest runners on earth, the history of the marathon as a sport, the spirit of the marathon, the cultural importance of the marathon. And in particular, I follow one runner, Joffrey, an astonishing Kenyan marathon runner, from his upbringing in rural Kenya to being one of the greatest of all time.
Why do men run, and why do men want to run fast? Is there any reason there that you discovered in the history, or how long the history of marathon or marathon running has been?
Well, we're not talking just about men, but
I mean, in general, humans.
mankind.
Yes.
Yes, we run fast. I don't know, perhaps for evolutionary reasons. There is a theory that one of our key developments as human beings was that we were distance hunters, endurance hunters. So we would track down prey over a long period, just running them to death, essentially. So that's one theory. I think it's the most basic thing to do with your body, isn't it? To explore how fast it can go.
Yeah, and I think we like to test how far we can push the limits and create new limits and create new boundaries or create new goals for us and keep advancing.
I think so. It's, to me, the marathon is a test of how far you're willing to look into the future. It's not just to do with your body, because anyone can run fast as they can for 100 meters. You can see where the end is. Whereas with a marathon, you're testing other abilities, your ability to pace a race, your ability to understand what kind of shape you're in, your energy reserve, and those of your competitors. There are all kinds of things going on with the marathon which make it very interesting as a sport.
Would you trace history of marathon running for our listeners? That I think in ancient Greece and in Athens there was this practice that was going on. Is that where it starts in the recorded history, or there are other countries or regions in the world that also had this ancient or long-running marathon?
Well, there is a myth. There is a myth. I would call it. It's no better than a myth. I would say that the marathon event, which began in earnest in 1896 at the 1896 Olympic Games, was meant to commemorate this event in ancient Greek history, where a messenger called Philippides ran from Marathon to Athens to deliver news that the Greeks had defeated the Spartans in battle. And that distance was around 26 miles, and that was what they were commemorating. But it's unlikely that Philippides ever made that journey, and in any event, it doesn't really matter. The marathon began at around 25, 26 miles in that 1896 Olympic Games. And the reason we run 26.2 miles now is because in 1908 at the London Olympics, there was this fantastic race. And that was for over 26.2 miles, an oddly long distance for the marathon. Back then, the marathon fluctuated anywhere between 24.5 and 25 and a half. And 26.2 was decided upon because they wanted to run exactly from Windsor Castle into the White City Stadium in London, in order that the royal family could watch the start and the finish of the race. And it was this very dramatic race where an Italian called Dorando Pietri appeared to be about to win the race, but he collapsed several times in the stadium and had to be helped over the line by officials. And the Americans, whose man came second, Johnny Hayes, came second, put in an appeal to the authorities, and their man was given the gold medal. So there was this huge controversy about who should have won the race. And after that race, newspaper readers in America and in England caught fire for this new event, the marathon. They were just so fascinated about the heroism of these men that had fought themselves almost to death in London. And there was this rematch at Madison Square Garden some months later between Johnny Hayes and Dorando Pietri, which was run inside at Madison Square Garden, 262 laps of Madison Square Garden. And the distance that everyone wanted to see them run was the London distance, this 26.2 miles. And that's really how the distance becomes enshrined in the culture. And that's why we run the marathon.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, you explored many great marathon runners, and one of them is a standout, and that is Joffrey Mutai. Would you explain to us how did you get in touch with him, and then what did you discover, and how the gentleman is so fascinating, and then how he became such a successful marathon runner despite his difficult childhood that you explore as well. So if you could give us a little bit more insights into that.
Yes, of course. My relationship with his name is spelt Jeffrey, but you pronounce it Joffrey for curious reasons. And so Joffrey and I met a little way into my reporting for the book. I'd taken 2 or 3 trips to Kenya and Ethiopia to try and find who my main characters would be for this book. And I was looking around and talking to some of the best people in the sport. And some athletes, as you'll know from watching TV interviews with athletes and reading newspaper reports about them, some are more interesting than others, and some seem to have more depth and have more of a backstory than others. And I think the first time I met Joffrey Mutai was actually in London. He was a spectator for the London Marathon, and he was a sort of honoured spectator because he was meant to be running the race the next year. And I was immediately taken with him. I thought he was interesting and reflective and soulful. And most importantly, he was extremely good at running the marathon. So in 2011, he ran the Boston Marathon in 2:03:02, which was then the fastest marathon ever run. And then he, in his next race, he broke the New York course record by nearly 3 minutes, which was, previously unthinkable. And so this guy had really ripped up the rule book in terms of what was possible in the marathon. So when you allied that prowess with this interesting, reflective personality, I thought this guy is my main character. And the more time I spent with him at his home in Kenya and at his training camp, which is up in the hills, in a place called Kapingatuni, which means the place of the lions. And, he stayed up in this very rudimentary training camp with about 60 other runners. And, we would talk when I stayed there about what his life had been and the many challenges that he'd overcome. And his life was really extraordinary. Not extraordinary by the, in the context of other marathon runners, but when you think about professional athletes, it's very rare to hear someone has overcome so many obstacles to get to the top of their sport. And Joffrey, he had been beaten up by his father. He had been homeless for a period as a teenager. He had worked in, breaking rocks in quarries to feed and clothe his younger siblings. He grew up in acute poverty in a dysfunctional family. And he found running in the way that many Kenyans found running as an escape route. And he had trained incredibly hard to fight his way out of the poverty into which he was born. He had trained harder. He had thought harder about his sport. And, in his late 20s and early 30s, that really began to pay off for him when he ran some of the most extraordinary marathons of all time. And it was really a privilege to be able to watch him not only race, but to follow him in Kenya and around the world as he grappled with where he'd come from and where he'd got to.
In your association with him, did you find there were certain things that were just driving him? Why was he so driven to excel despite his obstacles and despite his difficult childhood?
He said that running was the most joyful thing in his life. I think maybe he said that before he had children, but he did feel this immense joy from running, just from the act of running. He also loved trying to see what was possible for his body. He had no problem with pain. Really, he'd made an accommodation with pain. It was very painful training. It was very painful, to run 125 miles a week up and down hills, fast and slow, at altitude in the way that he did it. I mean, I cannot imagine how much suffering he has put his body through. But he loved racing and he loved the whole experience of running, and he loved to test his body. The way that he put it to me was, he said there was just something in my blood to run. When he was, not doing well, and he wasn't a professional runner in his early 20s, and he was working in bad jobs, cutting down trees or breaking rocks, he would sometimes go to a little local bar to watch the TV when athletics meets were on the TV. And he said he would sometimes come out in sweats just watching the guys on the screen running, because he felt that's where I should be. It was really a sense of belonging for him. He thought he wanted to be a runner so much. It was in his blood.
So he prepared himself early on, and he identified himself over there, and then he prayed, and he obviously paid for it in through a difficult and perseverance and a very hard training.
That's it. Yeah, I mean, his dedication is magnificent. But in fact, you could probably find there are thousands of people trying to become professional runners in Kenya, and very few of them ever make it. So, one of the things that I wanted to explore in my book was, why do certain people make it? It's not just a question of talent. Talent will get you so far, but it was a question of, how do you think about the sport? Are you smart? Are you analyzing your training? It's not just a question of working hard. It's a question of listening to your body and choosing the right races, and somehow being lucky as well. So to me, he combined a lot of those different things, and also following him made me realize, how short your career in the marathon can be, because he maybe had 3 or 4 years when he was right at the top of the sport, and his results ever since have tailed off. And I think, I wouldn't be surprised if he retires soon. So the glory is sweet but brief, and it's a whole life's work. So it's really an amazing sport, the marathon, which very few people know anything about.
As you were exploring, and you said that thousands of people just alone in Kenya start and compete, but very few make it. Are there few things that you discovered that the successful marathon runners do on an ongoing basis to get to the top of the sport?
Well, I mean, a facile answer would be they all run a huge amount. I mean, they work incredibly hard. There's no substitute for the work. Doesn't matter how talented you are. You do have to work hard. And then the other thing, I think, is that, they have very simple lives. The ones right at the top have managed to retain that simplicity in their lives when they're training. They sleep a lot. They eat the right things. They don't busy themselves with other activities. Their lives for 6 days a week is about running. And then on Sunday, they'll often drive home to see their families, go to church, and then they'll drive back to the training camp. That's really how their life goes. They have a single-mindedness, which I found very inspiring, actually.
So focused, disciplined, and there's no clutter in their mind and in their daily routine.
I think that's it. Obviously there are people who are more physically talented than others in any sport, but I think any aspiring sports person could learn from that sense of, it's this or nothing. I think one of the things that happens in developed countries like the USA or the UK or wherever is that kids happily have so many options, and sport is fun and sport is enjoyable, and you wouldn't want to take any of that away from them. All those choices, all those amazing things that you can experience in your life, and it's not just sport. It's you could maybe get into music, or you could become a writer, or you can fulfill your talent in whatever way you want, and there's all this choice. For those guys just to the west of the Rift Valley in Kenya, who have produced some of the greatest running champions, it's running or nothing. You're either a runner or you're going to be a farmer or a small businessman. The only way to make serious money is to run. The only way to be a champion is to run. So their drive partly comes from a lack of opportunity. There is this one outlet. I thought about it a little bit like sometimes inner city kids, in America, there were these great boxing champions. And I sometimes thought, what if the only thing that was in your neighborhood was a boxing gym? You'd try boxing. And that was really what I felt was going on in Kenya. The thing that they could all do was to run together.
But there are many countries on this earth that are impoverished, and there are many regions in many of even the most developed nations are also impoverished, but you don't see them producing these champions, as we call them.
No. So obviously there's something else going on.
Yeah.
So it's not just to do with economics.
And what sense did you get there?
Well, there are obviously certain, there are physiological traits that, in Kenya, it's one particular tribe, the Kalenjin tribe, who are particularly good at running. And there are certain physiological traits that are helpful towards running. They're, very low body mass, a lot of them. They're Nilotic people, so that means they come from the Nile Valley originally, but now they live at altitude. So one of the really interesting bits of research that's been done is that if you live at altitude, it's helpful to have kind of lowland ancestry, because essentially you're a lowland dweller who lives high, and that way you get all the benefits from the thinner air. So your lungs become much more efficient at processing oxygen. And there is this kind of myth that Kalenjin Kenyans have bigger lungs than everyone else, and I don't think it's true. The science doesn't back that up. What they have is much more efficient lungs, so they can they can ingest oxygen. So when they're racing at sea level, their lungs are a much more developed engine. So there are all these things about these curious accidents of culture, history. The tradition of running in that culture is huge. People were racing each other as kind of cattle rustlers until about 60 years ago, when cattle rustling was a big deal there. So there are all these different things that come together to form a culture, and there's no single answer. But I think if you lean too heavily on the genetic argument, I think that doesn't seem to hold up, because there seem to be all kinds of populations all around the world which could have this kind of athletic success, and it's just that these guys have it.
So it's a combination of the physiological, the genetics, and the lack of opportunities, and the terrain, and all the things have come together, just as Kenya is also very good and well known to have a region to grow roses in the mountains there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are no simple answers. Talking about human beings who are, infinitely complicated. I was very wary in the book of coming down on any one particular answer, and trying to explain something. Sometimes you can just tie yourself in knots. I wanted to lay out all the evidence, but then I just wanted to watch what these guys did from day to day and from month to month and year to year, rather than trying to analyze it every single step of the way. I wanted to understand what it was like to be that great at running.
Well, let's talk about that. What do they do day to day, month to month, year to year, and what it is like to prepare? Because many of them don't even have the camps or government-assisted facilities. Do they train themselves on their own? How do they know they're training well? How do they know their training is good or not good? How does all that happen? Because you are so close to them. So if you can explain that.
Yeah, sure. So mostly, a top marathon runner would run a couple of marathons a year and a number of shorter races to sort of tune up for those marathon events. So the marathon is really where you have a chance to make some big money, but you can tune up at half marathons and shorter events in between. And mostly they do that through an agent. So like any aspiring runner in Kenya or Ethiopia, which is the other great powerhouse of running, they're trying to find an agent who can help them get to races. And the agents come mostly from Europe and America. And then some camps have coaches that are employed by the agents, and some camps are just run by the athletes. And neither of those approaches has been seen to be more successful than the other. So day to day, they're training in their camps. They're following programs that were probably passed on to them by strong athletes who'd been in the camp before. another sort of product of a mixture of, I would say, European and American and Kenyan running thinking. So, a number of long runs with, shorter, more dynamic runs in between and interval runs and so on. The athletes themselves are kind of curating the program as they go along. And then they go to a big race. So they will get money from a race organizer to appear at a race, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars just to turn up at, say, the New York City Marathon or London. And then there'll be prize money on offer for them. So really, that's their lives. They go race to race until they can't race anymore, and they try and make the best career they can.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Are many of these Kenyan champions, are they self-trained, or they rely mostly on the camp? As you say, there are mixed results, but especially the main character in the book, Joffrey Mutai.
Joffrey didn't have a coach. Joffrey didn't have a coach in it, but he was the leader, the kind of de facto leader of the camp when I was there. So his camp had about 60 or 70 athletes, and Joffrey and a couple of the other senior athletes would set the programs and lead training. So, Joffrey would always be at the front of the pack when training was happening. And I sometimes followed them up into the hills, when they were training. I would go on a motorbike. And even then they ran past me most of the time. I couldn't go fast enough. So Joffrey set a lot of the training programs, but he would also provide things like food for athletes that couldn't afford food. Or he would, with his manager, get some new running shoes for those that couldn't afford them, or kit, or somewhere to sleep. He was much more than just a boss. He was a sort of paterfamilias figure who looked after people, and that does take its strain. He's not just thinking about running; he's thinking about all these other factors. His responsibilities become huge because he'd won a couple of big races.
How did he create his own training program for himself before he became so obviously well known? In the early days, before he was successful, how he prepared himself? What kind of disciplines he put himself that he thought that he may or may not get it in the camp?
Well, he would follow. Yeah, he would follow a training program, of another athlete. So he would ask, someone who was more successful than him to, whether he could follow the same program. And that's how it all works. You follow someone until you're the person that someone else follows. I mean, it's rudimentary, but it seems to work.
Mm-hmm. And it does work very well for him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you would think that, one would think that you would need the best facilities, and if you don't have them as you have them in Europe and United States, that you didn't even have a chance to be a top athlete, and certainly the Kenyans and Ethiopians come with nothing, and they prove everybody wrong.
Well, it's the beautiful thing about running is you don't need very much. He has, miles of hilly, altitudinous countryside to run through. He has the food he needs. He can go in his car to visit a physiotherapist in a nearby town. If he needs the kinks taken out of his back or whatever. So they have what they need. And I think the simplicity actually helps them. They're not thinking about high-tech gadgets or, a team of coaches or what have you. The simplicity does seem to help.
Mm-hmm. Switching back to the more generic and broader issues that are related to the humankind and at the physiological level, why it has been challenging over the years, or how much of improvement has been made in running faster a marathon, especially in the last 20 or 30 years?
So to put it this way, it's in 2003, Paul Turguts broke 2:05 for the marathon for the first time. 13 years later, we've got to 2:02:57. So that's a 2-minute plus drop in 13 years. The marathon world record gets chipped away at in little blocks of 10 or 15 seconds every year or two. It does come down, and people will have their own theories about why that is, but partly this is only part of the answer, but part of the answer is as soon as there is a barrier, people try to break it, and it's just in our natures to try and chip away at these barriers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is there any other character that we can talk about that you highlight in the book that is also that fascinating? Maybe one in Ethiopia?
Well, sure. And we have all sorts of characters, within the book, historical characters and what have you. I loved going. I mean, he's not a huge part of the book, but I loved going to see Haile Gebrselassie in Ethiopia. You could really see what a career in running could do for a person. When we met at his huge house in the nicest part of Addis Ababa, in top view, and he invited us to lunch, and we had this fabulous day up with him, and had long talks about his life and career. He's not only the greatest runner ever to have come out of Ethiopia, he's got the third biggest Hyundai dealership in Ethiopia. He's getting into politics. His life is much more than running now. He's a kind of national figure. So it was interesting to see, what could happen, and this was another guy that had grown up with nothing. So, to me, he was this amazing figure, very gregarious, good looking. And just to dwell on the genetic argument for a little bit, he said to me, if this is about genes, if my success is down to my genes, then why aren't my kids runners? And he pointed over to his kids, and these three quite chubby little kids were watching TV on the sofa. None of them looked like they would run, to the bus, let alone a marathon. And his point was, culture is everything. I ran because I had to, and my kids don't have to run. So that was a really instructive moment for me, I think.
It's about refusing to accept the defeat.
Refusing to accept defeat, but also just, accessing this, what's in your body. Some people don't have to do it. And in fact, you would never wish Haile's childhood on anyone. His father was terrible to him. He had real trouble as a kid. You would never wish it on anyone. He said to me, you can't be a good runner from a good family. It just, it was the idea that this kind of paucity of opportunities and this difficult upbringing hadn't stifled his talent, but it had fertilized it. That to me was the message that Haile gave me.
Mm-hmm. And it kind of fanned the burning passion.
Yeah.
Going back a little bit about the sport, and nowadays when you talk about the sport, money is always involved, and how the economics or the money has influenced the sport, or how big it has become in the last 10, 20 years?
Well, the money's got bigger, but it's big in African terms, but it's not big. Compare it to a soccer player, or in America, the NBA or NFL. The money is not big by those standards. I mean, Sammy Wanjiru, who was a very talented young runner, who's the Olympic gold medalist, and made a lot of money very quickly before sadly dying at the age of 24. He made, before he died, he made maybe $8 million between the ages of 18 or 19 and 24, which is fantastic money and mind-blowing considering where he'd come from. But it was not an NBA star, might make it in a season. So one thing that the money really has done is, I think, has increased the spectre of doping in the sports. And it is beyond doubt that there is significant amounts of doping that goes on now. Not to say that everyone's involved, but there's a good reason to believe that a significant number of people have been using drugs of various kinds. And so that was always something that I wanted to bear in mind, that this sport is not a fairy tale. It's any sport where people have a chance to get out of poverty, people are going to try and look for a shortcut to do that. And I really felt that in this case, that, it would be crazy to think that there wasn't doping going on in Kenya and Ethiopia and other countries that produced marathon stars, because there was so much at stake.
Fascinating book written by a fascinating author. Give us a little bit more perspective about how did you get involved in journalism and writing, and what brought you close to the pen and paper. Nowadays is keystrokes and the screen.
Yeah. So I was always interested in writing from a young age. I was heavily involved, and would be I edited my school newspaper and all that kind of stuff. And then when I got out of university, I joined the independent newspaper as a reporter, where I was there for 3 years, and I kind of graduated to a feature writer. And since then, effectively, I've been freelance for a number of different places, but my focus has become much more on writing long magazine stories. So now I write for the New Yorker and the New York Times Magazine and places like that, which give you the length and depth to really explore topics. And, I'd always wanted to write books, and I was fascinated by the marathon after I wrote a magazine story actually about Sami Wanjuru, that very talented young man who died. And so it felt like a natural progression for me to write this book. And I didn't know that it was going to take me 3 years of my life and involve something like 40 flights, all around the world to try and do the reporting. But, it has been an incredible experience. And what I love about my job is that every day feels different, and you just meet people from all different walks of life. I remember feeling that very keenly when I was in this place, Kapangatuni, in Joffrey Mutai's camp, and I just watched him do this incredible series of training runs. And then we'd had this long discussion very intimate discussion really, about his childhood and about his relationship with his father and what have you. And he turned in for the night, and I walked out, and there was this full canopy of stars, no artificial light at all. We were right on the equator line at 2,600 meters, 8,500 feet. And I was just about to go and, sleep in this kind of, tin roofed shack. And I was thinking, what other job could you do this? What other job allows you this kind of freedom and this kind of itinerant, curious lifestyle that I have? But it's fundamentally just every day is interesting. And I love telling stories.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Currently, where do you reside? And are you working just on the long magazine articles, or are you also working on other projects for the new forthcoming edition of book?
So I live in Manchester in England. I'm working on 2 or 3 stories for the New Yorker. I have a new book project on the go, which is very different, which is about an attempt to climb Everest in 1934, and a kind of round-the-world odyssey that led to that attempt. So it's historical, and it's going to stretch a lot of different muscles that I'm not used to stretching, but yeah, I'm really excited about it.
Oh, fascinating, fascinating. We have been speaking with Ed Caesar, the author of 2 Hours, The Quest to Run the Impossible Marathon. Thank you very much for your time and your comments.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.